As night falls, you reach the edge of a small village. There are no alehouses or inns where you could perhaps take up shelter for the night. You're gonna have to rely on the kindness of strangers once again, as you've done so many times before. You decide to knock on the door of the closest cottage. You take 4, maybe 5 steps towards the door before a big white dog begins violently tugging at the chain, trying to get to you, furiously barking. This makes all the dogs in the village start barking at once, signaling the presence of a stranger. In the distance you can hear doors opening and muffled voices. People are alarmed. You take one more step towards the door before it swings open, light pouring out. In the threshold, a tall, well-built silhouette. "Who goes there? State your business, stranger. What do you want?" "Shelter for the night," you reply. "I can pay for it." They ponder for a second, looking you up and down. Although dusty, your clothes are quite well made. They were quite expensive. They command the dog to quiet down, and it does so, sitting on its hind legs, still growling, still eyes locked on you. "Come inside, it's cold out." You step over the threshold and they close the door behind you. Inside, around a small wooden table, you see another individual, their partner, and 2 children having dinner. They pull up a stool for you and invite you over. In front of you they place a small wooden plate on which you see a slice of stale old rye bread, a generous piece of boiled salmon, a spoonful of pottage, a small bit of smoked bacon, and a very small piece of dried old cheese. It's more than enough for you tonight, so you have your fill. After dinner is done, the children are tucked into bed in front of the fireplace on some old pelts, under a heavy wool blanket. Your hosts then produce a drinking horn and fill it to the brim with fresh ale. Place it in front of you, sit on the other side of the table, and one of them says, "So, stranger, where do you hail from? What stories do you bring?" You take a long sip out of the drinking horn and take a peek towards the children. You see their small little faces peering curiously at you above the covers. You smile and realize it's going to be a very long night filled with wondrous stories. Welcome to today's episode. Hello everyone and welcome to Funky Monkey MP, the place where you get your weekly dose of miniature painting, history and world building. On today's episode we are going to talk about medieval food. What commoners ate, what middle class people, so knights, merchants and craftsmen ate, and what the nobility ate. Before we start our discussion, let us talk about the miniature. This is Whisper, the Sphinx sorcerer from Animal Adventures Tales of Cats and Catacombs. We're gonna have some fun with this little mini today. Enough about that, let us begin. First, I want to get a few things clear. Like in ancient times, in medieval times, people did not eat grayish, brownish goo with no taste, no flavor, no consistency. Of course, they ate porridges, of course, they ate different kinds of pottages, we're gonna come back to that. And of course, in moments of extreme famine, people ate grass. But that is not the topic of today's episode. We're going to talk about what people in general ate, especially here in Europe. A second thing, salt was a premium commodity. People used it sparingly, if at all, and usually food indeed was not that salty, but that does not mean that it wasn't flavorful. Now, let's talk about commoners and what they ate. By talking about commoners, we are going to cover most of the medieval diet, with the disclaimer that middle class people and the elite ate basically kind of the same thing, but in greater quantities, greater variety, greater quality. And of course had access to other ingredients. But the staples, the cornerstones, are kind of the same, although the quality varies wildly. With that out of the way, let us begin. The commoners. I'm going to start this part of the discussion by making a simple statement. The poorer you were, the browner your bread. This is pretty straightforward. In medieval times, people rarely, if ever, had access to white wheat flour. Most flour they had access to was barley flour, rye flour, millet, different kinds of seeds, different kinds of nuts, but rarely white flour. White flour was reserved for the nobility. As such, the poorer you were, the browner your bread. Bread was the cornerstone of the medieval diet, as it was the cornerstone of ancient diet. Alongside bread, you also had beers or ales. We're going to come back to ales. Another thing that was very important in medieval diet were vegetables. Everybody that lived in capital cities, in larger settlements, or in villages had a small vegetable garden. This was almost universal. Having a seasonal diet, people relied on this vegetable garden to have fresh vegetables at least in certain periods of the year. Alongside vegetable gardens, you would also find herbs and medicinal herbs. Simple herbs for flavoring food and medicinal herbs to alleviate some of their ailments. The most common vegetables that you would encounter in medieval times were carrots, radishes, turnips, and most importantly, cabbage. Cabbage was a very, very common staple vegetable. Besides this, you would also have seasonal fruit. People would go out and try to find berries and all kind of fruit, but mostly they relied on apples, pears and quince as they have longer shelf life and they grow quite easily. But they weren't limited to these fruits. They had access to whatever was in season at that moment. Pulse was a very important part of their diet. Peas, broad beans, lentils, chickpeas, and these are the main ingredients in pottage. Pottage is an all-encompassing term that covers everything that can be made in a pot. So basically stews or thicker soups, dairy. Most people had a sheep, a goat, even a cow around their homestead. This meant that they had access to raw milk. Raw milk, as you well know, spoils quite quickly. As such, they continued ancient traditions of making cheese, butter, buttermilk, and everything dairy related. This was a very important element in the medieval diet. This brought a lot of nutrition. Another aspect is meat. In medieval times, people don't usually eat meat as it is quite expensive, or don't eat a lot of meat and varied kinds of meat. It is quite expensive, and it would be nonsensical to slaughter a goat or a sheep or a cow that produce milk and wool. You wouldn't want to slaughter an animal that creates something in the long run. Of course, animals were slaughtered as they stopped producing or came closer to the end of their lifespan. And a second important thing was that if you slaughtered a larger animal such as an ox, a bull, a cow, you would end up with a limited but large quantity of meat that needed to be processed, that needed to be stored and consumed in a timely fashion before it spoiled. This wasn't ideal. Poultry. They didn't really eat the meat of poultry. Again, in the long run they produce eggs and they produce feathers. Feathers that can be used for pillows, for mattresses, so you wouldn't slaughter these animals unless they stopped laying eggs and they approached the end of their lifespan. But everybody had a pig. Pigs are very easy to care for. They eat anything, so you could feed them scraps, leftovers, and even slightly spoiled food. But before winter settled in, pigs were sacrificed. It's harder to take care of an animal over winter and they require more food. As such, they were sacrificed at the beginning of winter. Now, when it comes to pigs, every single part of the pig was used. From the blood to make blood pudding, or what we nowadays call black pudding, to the intestines that were used as sausage casings. Everybody in their household would have large hooks placed above their fireplace. On those hooks you would hang bacon and other pieces of meat that in this fashion got smoked, got dried, all without extra effort. People would preserve meat by smoking it, by curing it, or by salting it, although we're going to come back to salting, and by cooking it and leaving it in lard for longer periods of time. People also pickled vegetables, especially cabbage, so sauerkraut. Now let's get back to salted meat. If you salted meat, it meant that you had access to a lot of salt. That meant that you were either rich or worked in salt extraction. If you salted meat, you would have to cook it twice. Once to get rid of most of the salt, and the second time to actually cook it and make it edible. The salted water resulting from the first boiling would not be thrown out. It would be sold to tanners. Make a little something on the side and get rid of it. Tanners used almost anything in the curing of pelts and skins. Another important kind of meat that people in medieval times ate was fish. And surprisingly enough, the most common and the cheapest fish you could find in medieval times, and it was considered the food of the poor, was salmon. Salmon was very abundant in rivers across Europe and not only. As such, it was easy to catch, easy to process, quite delicious, and it was considered the food of the very poor. Another staple were pies. The basic pie crust was not usually eaten unless things were really harsh. Most times it would have been fed to the pigs, and you have to understand that the casing, the pastry itself, was just somewhat of a container. It's the way you would cook food inside the oven without it becoming very dry, and if you went out on the fields for a day's work, it would have been easier to take a pie with you rather than different foodstuff. We're gonna leave the ale for the end of the video. And with that, we are done with commoners. Let's take a look at the miniature before we move on to the middle class. I am brightening up Lothern blue with a bit of Baroth blue, and using this mix to paint Whisper's right eye, all the while leaving the left eye painted in a combination of mood green and Everland sunset, giving Whisper a very mystical and mysterious appearance. And now for the muzzle I am using a very watered down Abaddon black wash, just to darken the shadows a little bit. Knights, merchants, craftsmen, the middle class in medieval times. They eat almost the same thing as the commoners did, but in greater variety, greater quantity and better quality. First of all, bread. They didn't generally eat rye bread or millet bread or barley bread. No. They ate whole grain bread made with beer barm. Beer barm is basically the froth of the beer, which, not being pasteurized, meant it was quite yeasty and allowed the bread to leaven when baking. Being of the middle class meant that in the pottage you would be expected to put a bit of bacon, a bit of finer meats. Another very interesting aspect was that once you were in the middle class, you were expected and you were able to hire staff. You had a cook, you had a chambermaid, you had a chamberlain, the such. Having a cook meant that you had a greater variety of food and greater quality of food. Moreover, being richer meant you had access to more herbs and spices. this boils down to simply one statement. The richer you got, the more flavor your food had. Quite simple. Now, another advantage of being richer meant that you had access to a cookhouse and access to your personal oven. In medieval times, ovens were quite expensive to construct and maintain, and as such, they were usually communal. We're going to talk about this at the end of the video, but just remember that people had access to this kind of facilities. Another thing that distinguishes middle class from the commoners, the low class, is their tableware. If commoners used usually wood, which is quite cheap to obtain and things can easily be carved out of wood, when it comes to middle class, they start having perhaps pottery, which was, although not insanely expensive, it was quite expensive. You would perhaps start transitioning from wood to pottery, although not everything on your table would be pottery. It was still expensive. And when it comes to the cutlery, it would still be made out of wood, but finer wood and perhaps beautifully carved. And with that, I think I've covered the most interesting aspects of being middle class individual in medieval times. Before we move to the elite, let's go to the miniature, see how it's coming along. I have made a very thin wash of Macragge Blue using some contrast medium instead of water for a better flow. Now I'm using this wash to cover Whisper's coat, making sure that shadows are, although soft, quite visible. And I'm trying to make sure I don't cover areas already painted so I don't have to redo the paint job. The elite, high-class individuals, high nobility, even kings and queens. First and foremost, bread, their staple. They had access to white bread, highly processed flour. The mentality was that the more effort went into bleaching the flour, the more expensive it was, the higher quality. Of course, nowadays we know that's not quite the case. When it comes to vegetables, they had access to anything and everything. When it comes to meat, it's quite interesting because they ate poultry, they ate chickens. It was a debauchery. It was a show of rank. People relied on chickens for their eggs. The nobility had enough money to buy those chickens and slaughter them for meat. Another thing that was a staple for them was venison. Hunting in medieval times was a social event, and you would take your household, your retinue, and other noblemen who were visiting perhaps on hunts. When returning with your prey, the carcass of the, let's say, deer would be cut up and divided according to rank and statute. The highest ranking nobleman would get the finest cut, and then the second cuts would be given to the second ranking individuals, and then the third cut the other retainers, until you reach the guts, the intestines. Those were given to the lowest ranking retainers, and these guts are called umbles. The retainers would make humble pie. This is where the humble pie comes from. Fun fact. Now, besides this, when it comes to drinks, you had access to ales and ciders and wines and meads, but the most important element is that you had access to spices. Lots of them, a wide variety, and they were quite expensive. They were so expensive actually that noble households would have a spice case, a spice box, in which they would keep all of their spices. Things ranging from sage to saffron to cardamom to nutmeg. Nutmeg was so expensive that one nut was the equivalent of a whole week's worth of pay of a commoner, which was quite insane. They were so expensive and so valuable that people kept these boxes in vaults, and the most trusted individual in the household, be it the lady of the house, being the chamberlain, would always have the keys to the spice case on their person at all times. Although this sounds weird, I think this has a really neat place in fantasy world. Imagine in your D&D campaign having your party recover a precious, beautifully carved wooden box for a very hefty sum of gold. They don't know what's inside, but once they returned to the nobleman, they would see the case open and inside all of these expensive spices. That would be funny, surprising, silly. It would be a funny and interesting little adventure. Why not? Now, one of the most expensive spices in medieval times was raw sugarcane. This had to be grated to be used, and it was very, very expensive. That being said, having access to sugar and a lot of honey and thus sweets, the honey disease, so diabetes, was quite often among the nobility. Another disease that was quite common among the higher class in medieval times was gout. They had access to a lot of meat, and most of their diet consisted of white, highly processed bread and meat. This is not a good combination. Now let's talk about drinks. They had access to anything and everything they wanted to, but spirits are not that common in medieval times until the 15th, 16th, 17th century. Usually they relied on ales, ciders, wines and meads, so honey wine. With that, we've covered the most basic dietary elements of medieval nobility. Before we draw our conclusions, let's talk about the miniature, see how it's coming along. Now, using my apparently all-time favorite silver paint, Stormhost Silver, I am painting the metal elements of Whisper's coat and gear. Going back to the McCrieg blue wash, I am touching up the shadows of the coat. And going back to the turquoise made with Baharoth blue and mood green, I am touching up the highlights. Let's wrap things up. The conclusions you have to take away from this episode is that the commoners in medieval times ate much healthier than the nobility. They ate things that we now consider to be premium. In medieval times, they were considered rock bottom. They were considered awful. They were considered the lowest quality food. The middle class ate pretty well. They ate kind of the same things that the commoners ate, but they also had access to perhaps more alcohol, they had access to more sweets, and things started to get iffy from there. While the nobility ate like crap, let's be honest. Relying only on sweets, meat and bread, everything washed down with a lot of alcohol, doesn't mean it's good food. Another thing, I've mentioned herbs. When I'm talking about herbs, I want you to envision sorrel, sage, thyme, marjoram, laurel and everything in between. And they use them very often. When it comes to drinks, I want to be crystal clear. Morning ale is not a thing. Of course, there were some people who drank in the morning. There are people who drink in the morning nowadays. Of course, there were times when the water sources were contaminated. There are times when water sources are contaminated nowadays. Of course, people drank contaminated water and got sick and died. It still happens today, unfortunately. People knew the effects of alcohol, they knew the downsides of drinking a lot of alcohol, and people knew not to give children alcohol as a substitute for water. Please use your common sense. How long do you think people would actually last drinking only alcohol, morning, noon, evening, and still be able to function? And be alive? Not for long. Second of all, people knew to keep their water sources clean. They had wells, they had springs, they knew to keep them clean. And if you're still unconvinced, let me ask you this. Why was it a very common tactic in medieval times to poison the wells and burn the fields. The scorched earth tactic. If water wasn't drinkable, why bother poisoning it? See, doesn't make sense. Although people drank, and perhaps a bit too much, mostly throughout history they drank water. Morning ale is not a thing, although I want to be perfectly clear. It's your fantasy world, your rules. I use morning ale as well. I'm not here to judge, I don't care what you do in your fantasy world. I'm just giving you an anchor in reality to perhaps enhance your fantasy world, or at least find out something new. One other thing. In medieval times, monasteries were industrial centers, and most monasteries actually brewed ales, ciders, and made wines and meads. And to wrap things up, things like corn, tomatoes, eggplants, potatoes, peppers, chilies, and tobacco were not a thing in medieval Europe, Asia, Africa, or the Middle East. They were brought from the Americas at the end of the 15th century, the beginning of the 16th, and took quite a long time before taking root in Europe. Again, your fantasy world, your rules, I don't care, I use them and combine things from ancient times to medieval times and modern times, I don't care. I'm just giving you some interesting facts and information. And with that, I truly hope you got some inspiration today, or at least learned something new. Thank you so much for the privilege of your time. Please like, subscribe, share, hit the bell, leave a comment, and I'll see you all here next time on Funky Monkey MP. Have yourselves a wonderful, wonderful day. Cheers.